I've always been a faithful woman. My life was simple, and I was content with it. Every day, I took care of the house, made sure the meals were cooked, and kept everything in order. My husband and I had a peaceful life together. I loved him, and I thought I knew what my life was going to be like forever. There was never any reason to think things would change. I had a routine, and I stuck to it. I would wake up early, prepare breakfast, clean the house, and spend my days quietly, waiting for my husband to come home. Our life felt secure, and I was proud of being a good wife. But that all changed when I met him, my new neighbor, Luke. He moved into the house next door about a month ago. At first, I didn't think much of it. But every time I saw him, something inside me stirred. There was something about him that I couldn't explain. He wasn't like anyone I had met before. His smile, the way he stood tall and confident, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke, it all made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. Luke wasn't the kind of man you could easily forget. He was tall, with dark hair and a calm, strong presence. But it wasn't just his looks that drew me in. It was the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly who he was. He didn't rush through life like so many people did. He seemed to enjoy every moment, whether he was working on his garden, fixing his porch, or just sitting outside with a cup of coffee. There was something so peaceful about him, but at the same time, he was so full of energy. He made everything around him seem brighter, like the world was full of possibilities. I found myself thinking about him more and more. I would see him working in his yard, and I would catch myself watching him, even though I didn't mean to. I tried to stop myself, but I couldn't. There was something about his presence that made it impossible to ignore him. I would smile whenever our eyes met, but I always turned away quickly, feeling embarrassed, as if I was doing something wrong. It was silly because I was married, and I loved my husband. But something about Luke made my heart race in a way I couldn't understand. One day, as I was walking past his house with a basket of laundry, I heard him call out to me. "Hey, neighbor, need any help with that?" he said with a grin. It was such a simple question, but when he said it, it felt like the most important thing in the world. I didn't know how to respond at first, and I felt a little flustered. "Oh, no, thank you, Luke," I replied, trying to sound calm. But his smile was so warm, and he didn't seem to mind that I was a little awkward. "If you ever need anything, just let me know," he said. It was such a small gesture, but it made me feel important, like he actually cared. From that day on, we started talking more. At first, it was just small talk about the weather, about the neighborhood, about the things we both liked. But as the days went on, I found myself looking forward to seeing him. Our conversations became longer, and I felt something inside me growing that I didn't expect. It wasn't just friendship, it was something more. Luke had only recently moved into the house next door, and ever since, the neighborhood had been buzzing with talk about him. People were curious, and gossip spread quickly. He was a divorced man, living alone, and no one really knew much about his past. There was a sense of mystery surrounding him, something that made him stand out in a way no one else did. He wasn't like the other people in the neighborhood, quiet and predictable. No, Luke was different. He had a kind of charm about him that was impossible to ignore. Every time I saw him, I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly people were drawn to him. It was like he had this magnetic pull, something about him that made you want to be near him. He was always polite, with a warm smile and a friendly wave, and people seemed to love talking to him. Even the older women in the neighborhood, who had lived here for years, seemed to gravitate toward him. It was like he had an energy that made everything feel a little brighter, a little more exciting. At first, I just observed him from a distance, not thinking much of it. He was a neighbor, and I was happy enough in my own life. But there was something about him that lingered in the back of my mind. It wasn't just his looks, though I couldn't deny that he was attractive, it was something else. He had this way of making everything feel easy, like he had lived through something difficult and come out stronger on the other side. But it wasn't until that fateful day that I started seeing him differently. It all began when I was outside, tending to the flowers in my front yard. The sun was setting, and I was lost in my own thoughts, when I heard his voice calling out to me. "Hey, neighbor, those flowers look amazing. How do you keep them so healthy?" I looked up, surprised, and saw Luke standing on his porch, leaning against the railing with that easy smile of his. I didn't know what to say at first. His words felt different somehow, more personal. "Oh, thank you. I just water them every day and make sure they get enough sunlight," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded and came closer, walking down the steps of his porch. "I think I might need some tips," he said with a chuckle. "I've never been very good with plants." As we stood there, talking about gardening and life in general, I couldn't help but notice how natural it felt to be in his company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and before I knew it, I was laughing and sharing stories with him. I realized then that Luke wasn't just charming, he was easy to talk to, comfortable to be around, and there was something about him that made me feel alive, like I was seeing the world in a new way. That day marked the beginning of something I hadn't expected, something that would change everything for me. I remember the first time Luke invited me over. It was a quiet evening, and my husband was out of town for work. I was at home, feeling the familiar emptiness of being alone, when Luke casually mentioned having some leftover barbecue. "Why don't you come over? It's too much food for one person," he said with that boyish grin that always made my heart skip a beat. I hesitated. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind. What would people think if they saw me going over to his place alone? What if they talked? I had always been so careful, so devoted to my husband, that the idea of being seen with another man, especially one like Luke, felt risky. But then, I couldn't help but think about how lonely my evenings had been lately. My husband had been so wrapped up in work, barely noticing me when he was home. I had started to feel invisible, like I was just a part of the background. I looked at Luke's invitation again, and for the first time in a while, I thought about how different he made me feel. He saw me, really saw me, in a way that felt good. So, I pushed aside my doubts and told myself it was just dinner. Nothing more. A casual meal between neighbors. I couldn't let myself overthink it. When I arrived at his house, the warm glow of light spilling out from the windows felt welcoming. I stepped inside, and immediately, the scent of smoked ribs and freshly baked bread filled my nose, making my stomach rumble. Luke had clearly put some effort into the meal, and it made me feel special, like I mattered. He led me to his porch, where the wooden chairs were already set up, and a small table was filled with plates of food. As we sat there, eating and laughing, something inside me began to shift. I hadn't realized how much I had been craving connection until that moment. With Luke, everything felt easy. We talked about everything and nothing at all, his new life in the neighborhood, my old memories of growing up in the area, our favorite books and movies. It was light, but it felt real. And then, something unexpected happened. Luke started to listen to me. I mean really listen. He didn't just hear my words, he paid attention.